I'm Kimberly from Fat Quarter Shop, and today I'm going to answer the web's most asked questions about quilting. This is our version of the WIRED Autocomplete Interview quilting style. So stick around and see what kind of answers I come up with. So let's see what the first question is. So this question says, what supplies do I need for my first quilt? So that's a super easy question. I would say don't invest too much money up front. Make sure you're gonna like the hobby before you get into it. But really, you just need a basic sewing machine that can do a 1/4-inch seam. You need a rotary cutter, a mat, a ruler, and I would start with 100% cotton thread, and that's about it. And if you're gonna start with just one ruler, I would just get like a 6.5 by 24.5-inch ruler, because you can get all your cuts from a big ruler. So I wouldn't invest too much. Just those are your basic supplies you would need. So that was a beginner question. Let's see what question 2 is. So the second question is cutting. How do I cut fabrics for a quilt? So this is a much harder question, and it is pretty complicated, but I would say my first tip is use your ruler for your measurements. Don't use your mat. And I would just start with a beginner pattern, read through the pattern, do something easy, but you definitely, to cut your fabric, you're gonna wanna use your rotary cutter and a ruler. Another rule of thumb is whatever ruler you're using, use that brand throughout, because Creative Grids might have a different measurement than an Omni Grid, and it might just be a slight difference, but I would just use the same brand throughout. You could also join our YouTube channel, and we have a playlist called Ultimate Beginner Quilt Series, and that takes you through 9 quilt blocks, cutting all of it, and there's lots of resources in that will help you get started. So our third question from Google is, how do I prevent fabric from curving or wrinkling? So I think on this question, it's all about pressing and fabric preparation. What I would do is use a light starch or something to give your fabric stiffness, but before you cut, iron, get everything flat. If you start with fabric that's not ironed, it's gonna already be kind of wavy. Then when you cut your fabric, it's still gonna be wavy. So use some starch. I use a ton of starch, but if you're a beginner, just start with a little bit of starch. Make sure after you starch, your fabric is completely dry before you cut, and don't cut too many layers at one time. If you're cutting like 10 layers, of course it's gonna start being wavy because cutting is gonna kind of get a little bit off. So another thing is there's a difference between pressing and ironing. When I am working with quilting fabric, I'm going to press and I'm gonna kind of go up and down. If you start doing this with your iron, you're gonna stretch your fabric out. So press gently and don't push your fabric around too much. Okay, the fourth question is seams. How do I ensure accurate seams? So having a 1/4-inch seam is going to solve 90% of any kind of quilting problem you have. So there's 2 ways you can do that. You can either buy a 1/4-inch foot, and then that will tell you exactly where the 1/4-inch is. Or you can mark a 1/4-inch line on your sewing machine, and you can do that by getting the Sew Standard Seam Guide or any type of seam guide and using washi tape, because washi tape will not leave residue on your sewing machine to mark that 1/4-inch. And what I would do is start with some 2-inch strips, sew them together, press them, and when those two 2-inch strips are sewn together, it should measure 3.5 inches. So see if that works. Get your 1/4-inch down before you start making an entire big quilt. So the 5th question is, how do I prepare my binding? So what binding is that is the piece of fabric that you're gonna put on the edge of the quilt, and it's gonna cover the quilt sandwich. I like to use double fold binding instead of single fold. Single fold will wear away with time. I generally cut my strips 2.5 inches across the straight of grain, not bias. Bias is too stretchy for a beginner. And I use all the videos at the Fat Quarter Shop channel. Just search binding on that YouTube channel and we have at least 20 videos on it. If you want the simplest, you can go to the Ultimate Beginner Quilt Series, but I would tell you 99% of my quilts, I cut my strips 2.5 inches by width of fabric, put them wrong sides together, sew that down on the front, flip it over and hand stitch it down. There is also machine binding, where when you flip that over to the other side, you can stitch that down with your sewing machine. It is much quicker. I would say you need to be a little bit more advanced to do that. So I would start with hand binding if it's your first time binding. So our last question from Google is accuracy. How can I achieve accuracy in my quilting? So I would say if you're a beginner, don't focus so much on accuracy at the beginning, because that's going to come with time and experience. I would say starching your fabrics, using a 1/4 inch foot or a 1/4 inch seam, and pinning. That is what will give you the most accuracy. And then experience. You know, there's that rule that after you've done something 10,000 hours, you become perfect at it. That's kind of what it takes. So if you're a beginner, just go with the flow. So that wraps up answering the web's most searched questions for quilting. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, we have lots of free videos, lots of free content. And if you want to learn how to quilt, this is the channel for you. So make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.